Hello and welcome to Artists for Everyone. And today's project is going to be a cup of tea. So we're going to paint a cup of tea, and we're going to start with our drawing as usual. But first I just want to talk about my supplies really quickly. So I'm going to be using a small postcard size watercolor pad. You can use this Strathmore watercolor postcards, any watercolor paper cut to size. You can see I smudged my paper a little bit already. So we're going to be using that. I'm using a 2H graphite pencil because that's what I have handy, but any graphite pencil like HB, H2H, something like that would be fine. We don't want to use too soft of a graphite like a 2B because then it's really hard to get our pencil lines off of the paper. The graphite will tend to go into the watercolor. You can also use a watercolor pencil. And I can't find mine right now, and that's why I'm not actually, I lied. Here it is. My messy table. This is a watercolor pencil by Albrecht Dürer, by Faber-Castell and their Albrecht Dürer line, and it's a light gray. So you could use either one. The watercolor pencil is really great because the lines get absorbed into the painting, but for this painting we do need one graphite line, so it's a good idea to have a light graphite pencil handy. And then I'm going to be using my Wildthorne watercolors, these beautiful handmade gemstone and mineral paints made by Kim, my dear friend. And this collection here is something rather new, and it is a really wonderful selection of pigments that make all sorts of colors when mixed together. So we'll be talking more about that later, but these are the Wildthorne paints, and we'll be using a handful of these. We'll be using the gold and the buff Titane and the sienna brulee, and probably the ochre léger, and definitely the Cobalt Bleu Primaire. So we're going to be using those, maybe a little bit of wood violet. And if you don't have these paints, any watercolors will do, and I will leave substitutions for these paints in the description box below. Okay, so we'll be using that. I have a little mixing palette here, just a little flower mixing palette. Any kind of white plate will do. I usually use a white plate. I use this because it's small and fits well into the video area. And then I have my Sennelier 000 squirrel mop, but any pointed round watercolor brush in like a size 6 or 4, anything small like this will do that comes to a nice fine point. And I also have a roll of paper towels to wipe my brush, and of course a glass of water. So we're going to start with our drawing, and I'm going to move my paints and things aside so I have more room to draw. And as always, I tend to tilt my paper, and that's really handy. So I'm going to go ahead and use the watercolor pencil since I found it, and I'm going to start with drawing an oval shape, and that's going to be the top of my cup. So I'm going to put it a little bit over halfway on the paper, and I'm just going to draw an oval. And if you draw your oval, I recommend practicing this a few times just so you feel confident with it. Just practice it on a scrap piece of paper. But it's just an oval shape like this. And then I'm going to draw some straight lines from the side of the oval down for a bit to represent the sides of my cup. And then the bottom of the cup will be a curved line, and that will basically mirror what I've drawn for the top. So I'm going to draw that curved line at the bottom. So very simple. An oval with two straight lines and then a curved line at the bottom. And remember, we're not going for perfection here. This is a handmade painting from your heart, and our hearts are not perfect, and our hands are not perfect. So if your oval and your cup are not perfect, that is fine. We have many chances to try again, and each time we do something, we get better at it and feel more confident. So that is the basic parts of our cup. But I want to put a handle on my cup, and I'm going to make a little teardrop shape here, and I'm going to start where the oval and the side line of the cup meet. And I'm going to draw that up and out and let it touch the side of the cup. So you can see it's kind of a teardrop shape. And then I'm going to go inside that less than 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to mimic that line, the shape that I drew the first time, and go like this. So I want to show that this handle comes out and then in. So what I can do is start here at the curve and just draw a little line down. Okay, and that will be where my handle curves over and then wraps around, and then this section in here will be the inside of the handle. So I hope that makes sense, but just draw a little line that's starting at the curve that kind of comes down and touches the side of the handle down here. Okay, so our cup is now finished. So now I'm going to draw where the T is within the cup. And I'm just going to mimic the curve that I have. And let it sort of disappear. So that's going to be our tea. It's a pretty full cup of tea, which I like. So the next thing we'll do is we'll draw the plate, the saucer that our cup sits on. And I'm going to also draw an oval. And I'm going to start about halfway up on the cup and just draw an oval down. And it might go behind your handle. So there is my saucer, all right? And I thought we'd put a bag of tea in our cup. So all I'm going to do is in here in the tea, I'm going to draw a little pointed roof shape, sort of like an angle, and then I'm going to draw a line to connect it. Okay, so it's sort of like my tea bag peeking out here on the side. See how I just drew a little point for the top of it? And then I'm going to use my graphite pencil, and I'm going to take the tea string and put it down here on the saucer. And then I'm going to draw a little rectangle to represent the tag on my bag of tea. And that is all we need to do for our drawing. All right, so our drawing is finished. Pretty simple. So practice this a couple times if you feel uncertain about it. So practice it on a scrap piece of paper, even twice, and you'll feel much more confident about drawing it on your watercolor paper. And then always remember that you can erase your lines a little bit if you need to, okay? I'm going to bring back my paints and my palette, and I want to make sure you can see those. Okay. I'm going to move this over a little bit so I have some room. And we're going to start by painting a layer on our entire teacup. We're going to paint it right over the tea, right over the tea bag, right onto the plate, but we're going to not paint the tea tag, okay? And I'm going to use the buff Titane, so it's like an ecru color. Some paint manufacturers make this, it's called buff titanium. Or you can also mix it yourself by using a tiny bit of white watercolor and then a little bit of maybe sienna brulee or burnt sienna or something, just to give it a little bit of an ecru tint. So you can see I have a nice juicy puddle of it here in my palette. And I'm going to start at the top. And I'm going to be as careful as possible when I go up to my pencil lines And since this is watercolor pencil, I can go right up to it and hopefully it will get absorbed into that paint. So I'm going to be careful around the tea bag, but I'm not going to worry too much if I get into it. And I might wet my brush a little bit and then pull the paint over the tea bag. And then I'm going to continue down the cup. So again, I'm moving my paper to make it more comfortable for me, to make my brush strokes as comfortable as possible. That's different for all of us, so you'll find your own way that feels most comfortable for you. And you'll notice that I'm painting each section of the cup at a time, okay? And then I'm going to come over here, turn my paper, and I'm going to paint the handle. And notice I'm holding my brush down here toward the tip, and that gives me more control on these really small areas. Trying to stay within my pencil lines. Just painting the little handle. Okay, and now I'm going to paint the saucer. There's a little tiny bit of my saucer peeking through, so I'll just add that in there and then pull. If my paint pools, I can pull it down. When I go up to the cup, I'm not exactly touching it, but just leaving just the tiniest bit of white space if you can. Notice again, I'm turning my paper. I'm always doing that. You know, hopefully it's not too annoying when you're watching the video, but it is a really helpful thing for us to turn our paper. Can't tell you how helpful it is. So now I'll do over here, and I'm going right over that graphite line. It won't matter at all. But notice that I'm avoiding the tea tag, so I can, I want it to be a really bright color, so I don't want this ecru underneath it. I'm using the tip of my brush to kind of paint around it. Okay, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm really happy with my edges. Just kind of go around. Okay, so that is all we need to do for our first step. We are covering the cup and the handle and the saucer, avoiding the tea bag with this buff Titane, this kind of ecru color. Now I need to let this dry, so I'm going to turn the video off, and then I'll be back to show you the rest. Okay, so my first layer of watercolor is now dry on my teacup, and we're going to go right into mixing up a shadow color, and we're going to put some shadows on our teacup and saucer. And for my shadow color, I want it to be sort of a pretty kind of cool gray blue. And so I'm going to start with my Cobalt Primaire and add that to my palette. And I want it to be, I don't want it to be too dark, so plenty of water in there so you can kind of see. It's nice and juicy. And then I'm going to add a little bit of sienna brulee. Okay, so sienna brulee is a burnt sienna color. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of that and add it in until it kind of mutes it out a little bit. Just a little bit of at a time. You want it to still be bluish, but you don't want it to be too brown. So if you end up putting too much of the sienna brulee in, then you can add a little bit more blue. But I also want to make sure I have plenty of water in here. Okay, so once I have that, I'm going to put some on my brush, just sort of dab it off on my paper to take off any extra. And then I'm going to paint a shadow underneath my cup. Now, because my cup has a handle, I have to consider that. okay? So I want to make sure that I put the handle in as well. And my light source is coming from the upper left, so my shadow is going to be cast to the right. And I'm going to start at the bottom of my cup, and I'm going to just kind of take my paint around my cup all the way to about halfway between the bottom of the cup and the handle. So I'm putting that in, and then I'm going to make my shadow come out a little bit to the right. And if I have too much paint, I'll dry my brush off and sort of wick it up a little bit. And then I'm going to turn my paper and I'm going to paint a little shape here that's coming kind of off the side to the edge of the plate, and that represents the shadow of my handle. Okay, so you can see it's sort of this little oval shape coming off of the bottom of the cup, and then over here to the edge of the plate, the saucer, representing the handle of my teacup. And that's all I need to do for the shadow underneath my cup. Okay, so you can see it sort of represents a shadow. Now I'm going to paint the shadow on the handle. So I'll dry my brush off well, pick up some more of my blue paint, give it a little stir. Then I'm going to dry my brush off just a tiny bit. I'm going to turn my paper and I'm going to paint the bottom section of the handle. So where it meets the cup at the bottom. And then I'm painting it up to where that little line is that we drew. Okay, so that sort of gives us the illusion that that our cup handle is turning and that it's in shadow. Okay, because it's the underside of our handle. Now typically where our handle meets the cup is going to be in shadow a little bit too, because it's curving down toward the cup. And so I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to take a little bit of that blue paint, just a tiny bit, and make a little tiny shadow right there. And I don't want that to be too dark, so I'm going to rinse my brush and dry it off. And I'm just going to soften that edge. If it's too wet, just dry your brush off again. Okay. So it's not, I need to soften that a little bit more. So you can see I don't want a really hard line, so I can just push that paint down toward the cup and make it as soft as possible. So that is my handle. It's now done. Now, I also want to put a little bit of shadow inside of my teacup, okay? Because it would be a little bit in shadow. This part is going to be a little bit lighter over on this side, and then on this side it's going to be darker. So I'm going to mix up my paint again, dry my brush off, and I'm going to start here on this side, and I'm going to paint up to where the T line is, over to where the inside of my cup disappears. Rinse my brush, dry it off really well, and then I'm going to soften by pushing into that blue paint and sort of blending it here. So I'm using a clean, damp brush, not dry, and sort of blending it in. Okay, so it has the illusion of being in shadow. Okay? And I also want to paint a little bit of a shadow sort of around my teacup on this side. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more of that blue paint. And I'm just going to put a tiny little bit of it on this side. You can go right over that T tag, just a little mark like that. Clean, damp brush, and then I'm going to soften that. See, I'm just kind of making it disappear. So that just gives our cup a little definition on that side where it sits on the plate. And that's all I need to do there. Okay, so now our teacup shadows are complete. One more thing, I would take a bit more of the blue-gray, and I would just sort of rim the edge of your tea tag, just a little bit. See, just a tiny little bit there on the tea tag. Now my shadow is complete. So we're going to paint the cast shadow from the bottom of the saucer now, and I want it to be a little bit different than the shadow that I used on the cup. So I'm going to use the same blue-gray mix that I already have, and I'm going to add a little bit of wood violet to that. So by putting a little bit of wood violet in, or any kind of violet or purple pigment, I'm going to get sort of a more purpley gray. If I need to add a little bit more blue, I can. If I don't feel like I have enough paint, so I can add a little bit more blue to that, and then of course a touch more of the sienna brulee or burnt sienna. So now I sort of have this purpley blue-gray pigment. And the same thing, I'm going to start at the bottom of my oval where my table would be. I'm going to paint a line around my saucer, and I'm going to take it all the way about halfway up on this side. And I'm just going to let it sort of taper off, and then I'm going to grab some more paint and I'm going to make this bigger. So I want to make it like a sliver moon. Let it taper up on the sides here. And so you see it's sort of a sliver moon shape. Get a little bit stronger on this side, just like we did for a teacup on the saucer. And then I'm going to clean my brush and dry it off. And I'm going to take clear water, clean damp brush, and just sort of soften that outer edge of the shadow. Just sort of diffuse it a little bit. And then if I have any more of the purpley gray left, I can just drop it in right at that line where the edge of the saucer meets the shadow, just to make it a little bit stronger there. There, I think that's great. Okay, so now I'm pretty sure, because we're using such light layers of paint, that my shadow inside the teacup is dry, so I can start to add the tea, but I'm going to give it one more second to dry, and I'm just going to paint my tea tag. And you can choose any color you want, any color at all. I'm just going to use straight cobalt blue because I love it so much. And I'm going to very carefully paint the tea tag. Just a little rectangle sitting on my plate. I find in my own work that if I limit my palette within a painting, okay, and I use colors that are already being used in the painting, that I have more harmony. So because I use this cobalt blue to make the shadows, it really fits well in the entire look of the painting. And I find that a really helpful thing. So that is done. So now I think we can paint our tea. And we're going to start with the sienna brulee. And just give ourselves a nice puddle of it in one of our palette wells or on our palette. And it's this beautiful earthy orangey red. And to that, I'm going to add some ochre léger, which would be like a yellow ochre, because I want it to be sort of a golden tea color. So burnt sienna and yellow ochre. Okay, so I have this beautiful kind of golden warm brown. And I'm going to make sure I have plenty on my brush and then roll my brush a little bit to take the extra off. And I'm going to go ahead and paint the tea. Now, my tea bag comes up above the tea. Okay, so I'm not going to paint the tea bag. I'm going to paint around the tea bag. And I'm holding my brush toward the bottom so I have the most control. And I'm painting in this tea. And I'm going to move my paper around so I have the best angle possible. So painting around the tea bag. I'm just putting in a layer of tea. I'm thinking mine is Irish breakfast. So think about that for a minute. Depending on the kind of tea you want to paint, you could paint like a magenta color if you were having a hibiscus tea. You could paint kind of a clear greenish yellow if you were having chamomile. All right? And I'm going to take a little bit more of my burnt sienna, and I'm just going to drop it in to the top section. So it just gives it a little bit of variation, and then a little bit at the bottom. So my tea is a little bit lighter in the center and darker toward the edges of the cup. And that is all I need to do for my tea. So the very last step of this, before we put our final touches on, is going to be the tea bag. And because I want this layer to dry before I paint the tea bag, I'm going to turn the video off, and then I will be back in a little bit to show you the final 2 steps. Okay, so our painting is now dry, and when I came back to my table to check it, I noticed a mistake. And you would think that someone who does this every day for a living wouldn't make mistakes like this anymore. But here's my mistake, and we can learn from this. So remember I said that our light was coming from this direction, and that's why our shadow was cast on the right side more strongly. So I put the shadow inside the teacup on the right side as well, and that is actually incorrect. The light would be hitting this side of the teacup, and this side would be more in shadow. The great thing is that we can fix that. So I'm going to mix up a little bit more of my blue shadow color, and so you remember it was the Cobalt Blue and the Sienna Brulee. So Cobalt Blue, or any kind of like ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna. So you see, if I put too much burnt sienna in, how it turned grayish brown. So I'll just add more blue, and now I have that lovely gray blue. So I'm going to dab my brush off, turn my paper, and I'm going to put this darker gray blue over here on this side of the cup. And I'm even going to paint this tiny little section behind the tea bag. Okay, rinse my brush off, dry it, and then soften the shadow out. So now this side of the teacup looks a little bit darker than the right side, and that's fine. I'm happier now. I'm just going to make sure that my edges are nice. I can use the tip of my brush. And I see that I got a little bit into my tea, so if I clean my brush and dry it off, I can very lightly lift that. I probably lifted too much, so I can take more of the tea color. Just drop it in there. Okay, so I fixed my mistake. And while we're at it, I'm also going to put a little bit of shadow on the right side of the teacup, because again, this side over here is light, this upper corner is light, but down here no light would be able to get to it. So I can take a little bit of this blue-gray, and I can paint just a line on the side, rinse my brush, dry it off, and then soften that shadow. So it gives it just a tiny hint of a shadow on that side where it blends into the shadow that it's casting. Now, I need to let it dry for a few more minutes, and then we'll come back and finish the cup. Okay, so it's all dry again, and the next thing I want to do before we paint that tea bag is I want to rim the cup and the saucer in gold. I just thought it would be a lovely touch. And I'm going to take some of my gold mica, sun gold mica, and any kind of iridescent gold watercolor would be fine, but I'm just telling you, this gold is the best I've ever used. So I'm going to get a nice little puddle of it, make sure my brush has plenty of paint in it, and then I am going to touch my brush to my paper to make sure I don't have too much. And I'm going to start with my cup. And I'm going to use the very tip of my brush with my hand holding it toward the bottom so I have lots of control. And I'm going to rim the edge of my cup in this gold. So I'm just painting these little short strokes and moving along. If you get a little bit out of line, that is fine. You see how I'm turning my paper and just making a line of this gold around that entire oval that we drew to show the edge of our teacup. Okay, so now my teacup is rimmed in gold, and now I'm going to do the same for the saucer. So I'll grab more gold paint, dab my brush off to make sure there isn't too much. And I'm going to start here, and when I come, the tea bag string is so fine, I can kind of go over it, but I'll just be very light, sort of skip over that. So the same thing, I'm just pulling my brush, the tip of my brush, making a line of gold paint around the entire saucer. This is also wonderful because it hides our edges a little bit, gives us a nice clean finish. Notice I'm turning my paper all the time to make it easier for myself. To the handle, and then I'm going to skip over the handle and then just finish that little piece. Depending on how you drew your handle on your cup, yours may not have continued, but when I'm drawing that oval, I want to make sure that it would connect on the other side, see? And that's another tip. You can also draw that line straight through to make sure it connects, and then just erase the extra line that would be behind the cup. So now my pretty little teacup is rimmed in gold, and I just love it. Love it, love it, love it. So this gold paint dries fairly quickly. And while we're giving it just one more second to dry, I'm going to make some color for my tea bag. And all I'm going to do is use the raw umber. So this sort of lovely brown. Any raw umber would do, any kind of brown watercolor paint, but this one is particularly beautiful. So I've got a nice little puddle of raw umber paint. And I still have a little bit of cobalt in here from where I painted my tea bag, and I might use that. So to paint the tea bag, I'm going to cover it in a water glaze first. So I'm going to start at the top and put a light coat of water. I don't want it to be pooling, so if I have too much water on my brush, I can dry it off. I'm only putting the water on the tea bag. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of my raw umber on my brush. And I put it in my palette first because if I took it straight from the pan, there's a chance that it might be too strong. So I put it in my palette and added some water to it. And all I'm going to do is touch the tip of my brush to the bottom of that tea bag, making sure I don't go over the gold. And I'm going to let the water glaze pull that raw umber up, okay? So it just has, it gives us the illusion that our tea bag is white and sort of transparent, and we can see the tea leaves inside. And that's it for my tea bag. So my cup is really basically done, but whenever I finish a painting, I like to take a look at the overall picture and see where I could make it better. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit more of the blue-gray mixture under my cup and a little bit more of my purpley-gray mixture under my saucer. So I can go back to my blue-gray mixture and wake it up. And then using the tip of my brush, I'm just going to draw a very fine line of that mixture right under my cup, just to give it a little bit more of a shadow there. And then I'll add a tiny bit of wood violet to that blue-gray, so I have more of a purpley gray. And I'm going to do the same thing on the saucer. So get the paint on my brush, dab it off, and then put a very fine line of that lavender gray right where my saucer meets the cast shadow. And now I'm super happy with it. Looks great. Okay. Is there anything else I would do? You know what? I tell you what. There is one more thing I would do. So my graphite line for the tea string is there and I can see it, but I think I'm just going to make it a little bit darker. So I can start at the tea bag and I can very lightly go over it. Very tip of my pencil. And then I might just line the edge on the right corners of my tea bag where it sits onto the plate, so it looks like it's got a little bit of cast shadow and it's being lifted off the plate a little bit. You see that? Just adding that tiny bit of graphite here gives it a little bit more dimension. And now my teacup is finished. I really love it, and I know just who I'm going to send it to. And so I'm going to sign my name with my little monogram. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this project. I hope you'll try it, and I hope you'll share it with me on social media. I will leave my Instagram name and my Facebook account in the description box below. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now go have a cup of tea. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you will subscribe to my channel so you'll get all the latest updates. Thanks so much.